Between 1100 and 1500, roughly half of all medieval castle residents experienced temperatures so low they could see their own breath while sleeping indoors. Stone walls stood 10 feet thick in some places, drawing in cold like magnets and radiating it throughout every chamber. While we complain when our heating dips below 68 degrees, these people faced freezing to death in their own beds without a single thermostat in sight. How did anyone survive sleeping in what were essentially refrigerated stone boxes? Here's what it was really like to battle the deadly cold inside medieval castles each night. Before we start though, if you fall asleep to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I'm always curious where everyone's listening from, so comment your location and what time it is. It's wild to think some of you might be having breakfast in Tokyo, while others are drifting off to sleep in Chicago. Alright, let's head back to medieval Europe. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously, adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're gonna want to be cozy. Your eyes open to darkness. For a second, you're disoriented. Where are you? Then it hits you. The year is 1320, and you're waking up in a stone chamber of Warwick Castle in England. The first thing that registers isn't sight, it's cold. A cold so deep it feels like it's coming from inside your bones. The frigid air burns your lungs with each breath. You can actually see that breath hanging in the air like morning fog. This isn't some minor inconvenience. This is the kind of cold that kills people. God's teeth, it's freezing, mutters the servant, trying to rekindle the fire that died hours ago. His fingers are stiff, barely able to strike the flint. Unlike your comfortable bed right now, where the worst thing you might face is a slightly chilly bathroom floor in the morning, this cold is your constant enemy. Stone. That's the problem. The same material that made castles great for defence made them absolutely terrible for staying warm. And we're not talking about thin stone walls either. The walls at Warwick, a visiting mason once told me, 10 feet thick in some places, 10 feet of solid stone that soaks up cold like a sponge and holds it for days. Stone doesn't just let cold in, it actively works against you. It absorbs the freezing temperatures from outside and radiates that cold into the interior spaces. It's basically a giant cold battery, storing the chill and slowly releasing it directly into your living quarters. Not ideal. You sit up in bed, wincing as your bare feet touch the stone floor. It's like stepping onto ice. Not a great start to your medieval morning, and it's about to get worse because someone's pounding on the door. My lord the Eastern Wall Guard reports riders approaching. And just like that, you have to leave whatever warmth you've managed to create overnight. Because that's the thing about castles. They were built for war, not comfort. Medieval castle designers had one priority: don't get murdered by invaders. Staying warm was way down the list, somewhere after impressive-looking towers and good views for archery. Think about it, those arrow slits that were perfect for shooting at enemies, also perfect for letting in freezing drafts. Those tall ceilings that allowed smoke to rise, also created massive spaces impossible to heat. The Great Hall at Warwick could fit 3 modern houses, a historian once explained to me. How do you heat something that size with just wood and coal? You don't. You just accept being cold. Wait, it gets better. Or worse, I guess, depending on how you look at it. The layout of most castles made the cold problem even more fun. Spiral staircases connected different levels, essentially creating perfect wind tunnels. Open courtyards allowed wind and snow directly into the centre of the castle. And windows, if you were lucky, they might have wooden shutters. Actual glass was rare and reserved for only the wealthiest castles, and even then, only in a few rooms. My grandfather served at Windsor Castle, a blacksmith told me, while working on some castle hardware. Said even the king's chambers had drafts strong enough to blow out candles. If the king couldn't escape the cold, imagine what it was like for everyone else. Now picture this. You're the lord of the castle. You've got the best accommodations possible. Your bedchamber is in a tower room. Sounds nice, right? Nope, because heat rises, sure, but towers stick out from the main building, meaning they're surrounded by cold air on 3 sides. Your fancy tower room is basically a medieval refrigerator. Hold up. Let me paint you a picture. The tower room at Kenilworth Castle in winter, stone walls sweating with condensation, the tapestries on the walls actually moving from the wind seeping through the mortar, the metal hinges on the door so cold they could burn your skin if you touched them bare-handed. That was luxury living in medieval England. You know what's the real killer, a castle guide once told me during a private tour. The dampness. It wasn't just cold, it was wet cold, the kind that gets into your joints and never leaves. He wasn't exaggerating. Medieval castles were frequently built near water for defensive purposes. That meant fog, mist, and damp air were constant companions. Stone absorbs moisture, and that moisture made the cold even more penetrating. Modern cold is nothing compared to the bone-deep damp chill of a medieval castle in December. So this was the reality. Cold stone floors that felt like ice beneath your feet. Walls that radiated coldness. Drafts strong enough to make flames dance wildly. Damp air that made everything feel wet. And winter nights that lasted 14-16 hours. In other words, the perfect recipe for hypothermia. "You're wondering how anyone survived, right?" said an elderly docent at Bodiam Castle who'd been studying medieval life for decades. That's what everyone asks, and honestly, not everyone did. Winter deaths were common. The cold took the very young and the very old first. Okay, I know what you're thinking. If it was so terrible, why didn't they just build warmer castles? Good question. The answer is that they were fighting different battles than we are. Their primary concern was staying alive in a violent world where neighbouring lords might decide your land looked better flying their banner. Stone walls kept out arrows and resisted fire. Cold was a secondary enemy. I mean, imagine your house being designed primarily to prevent people from murdering you, with comfort as a distant afterthought. That's castle life. The Lord's wife appears at the doorway, already dressed in multiple layers despite the early hour. "The eastern storage room is freezing over again," she says with resignation in her voice. "The apple barrels..." You nod. This happens every winter. The food stores start to freeze, which means some will spoil when they thaw. It's a constant battle, one more worry and a long list of winter concerns. "Send 3 men to move the barrels closer to the kitchen," you say, your voice gruff from sleep and cold. That's another thing. The kitchen was often one of the only genuinely warm places in the entire castle. The fires for cooking burned nearly all day, making it a haven of warmth. Which is why, as we'll see later, sleeping arrangements weren't what you might expect. The morning light struggles through the window coverings, not glass but oiled parchment that lets in some light while keeping out the worst of the wind. It casts a dim, yellowish glow across the room, revealing your breath still visible in the air. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because surviving in these conditions wasn't just about enduring the cold. It required an entire system of knowledge, techniques, and daily practices that modern people have completely forgotten. Medieval people weren't stupid, a professor of medieval studies once told me. They were resourceful as hell. They had to be, or they'd die. And he was right. The men and women who lived in these frozen stone fortresses developed remarkably effective strategies for staying alive. Strategies that differed dramatically depending on your status in the castle hierarchy. For you, as the Lord, there were certain advantages, but even with those privileges, winter nights were a battle between life and a cold so intense it could stop your heart while you slept. So how did they do it? How did people survive sleeping in what amounted to refrigerated stone boxes? The answer involves heated rocks, clever bed designs, strategic body heat sharing, and specialized servants whose only job was to keep you from freezing to death in your sleep. The first rays of sunlight now illuminate the frost that formed overnight on the inside of the window covering. Another day of fighting the cold begins, and as you swing your legs out of bed, you realize that your real enemy isn't the potential invaders outside your walls. It's winter itself. Your steward appears, looking tired but dutiful. "My lord, shall I have the bed warmed again tonight with the heated stones? We're running low on proper fuel." You nod grimly. "Double the stones. Winter's teeth are sharp this year." He bows and retreats, already mentally calculating how to keep the household from freezing for another night, because that's what castle life was really about: survival, one freezing night at a time. And as you face another frigid day, you can't help but wonder how the rest of the castle residents are faring. From the highest noble to the lowest servant, everyone is fighting the same enemy, a cold so intense it seems alive, hunting for any weakness, any opportunity to steal the warmth from human bodies. But the fascinating part is how differently each person experienced and battled this cold, depending on their place in the castle hierarchy, which brings us to the most important survival tool in any medieval castle: the bed. Not just any bed, but a very specific kind of bed that was designed with one purpose in mind: keeping you alive until morning. The bedchamber door creaks open and a blast of cold air rushes in. Two servants enter carrying something that looks like a giant metal frying pan with a long wooden handle. Inside are glowing coals from the kitchen fire below. This isn't breakfast being prepared. This is the difference between surviving the night and freezing to death. "Mind the embers, boy," snaps the older servant to his younger assistant. "One spark on these linens and the whole chamber goes up." And he's right. The warming pan they're carefully sliding between the bed sheets is essentially a fire hazard on a stick, but in a medieval castle, this dangerous tool was considered essential technology. Welcome to the medieval bedroom, perhaps the most sophisticated survival system in the entire castle. Everything about it, from its design to its materials, was engineered for one purpose: keeping human bodies warm enough to wake up alive the next morning. The four-poster bed wasn't created because it looked fancy. It was a medieval life support system. "See those curtains?" the castle steward explains, pointing to the thick fabric hanging from the bed frame. "Those aren't for privacy, they're for survival." He's not exaggerating. The four-poster bed with heavy curtains was essentially a tent inside a freezing room. Once you pulled those curtains shut, you created a microclimate, a tiny enclosed space where your body heat could actually warm the air around you instead of instantly disappearing into the vast freezing chamber. Think about it. Without those curtains, any heat your body generated would rise straight up and away from you. The enclosed bed kept that precious warmth trapped where you needed it most. The bed itself sits high off the ground, sometimes 3 feet up. This wasn't for show either. It was strategic positioning to avoid the coldest air in the room, which settled near the floor. "The height matters," says the steward, tapping the wooden frame. "Cold air sinks. Up here, you might be 5 degrees warmer than if you slept lower. 5 degrees might not sound like much, but when you're hovering near freezing, it could mean the difference between life and death." Now let's talk about what you're actually sleeping on. The mattress itself is a marvel of medieval engineering. It starts with a layer of ropes stretched tight across the wooden frame, the original box spring. These ropes need regular tightening, which is where we get the phrase "sleep tight." "Turn the crank twice a week or you'll sag to the floor," advises the lady's maid, demonstrating how the ropes are tightened. "And when they're too frayed to hold, you'll need new ones. Mark it in the household accounts." On top of these ropes sits the mattress. And if you're lucky enough to be nobility, yours is stuffed with feathers. Down mattresses with a premium option, insulating against the cold rising from below while conforming to your body to prevent cold air pockets. "The featherbed cost more than a year's wages for a labourer," the steward says with pride, "gathered from geese across 3 counties. Beneath you would be a linen sheet, possibly, but unlike modern bedding, you wouldn't have a sheet on top of you. Instead, you'd have wool blankets, lots of them, and possibly furs if you were wealthy enough. Sheepskins with the wool still on," explains the lady's maid. "Layer them wool side down toward your body for the most warmth." And speaking of layers, let's discuss the pre-bedtime ritual that's currently underway in your chamber. The servants are moving methodically, preparing your bed with the precision of modern surgeons. First, they're using that warming pan, sliding it between the layers of bedding to remove the worst of the dampness and chill. They'll do this for nearly half an hour, moving the pan continuously to prevent scorching the linens. "Check for dampness here," the head servant instructs, pointing to the middle of the mattress. "If it feels wet at all, keep warming. Nothing will kill you faster than a damp bed in winter." He's right. Dampness was the silent killer in medieval castles. The stone walls sweated condensation in changing temperatures, creating a perpetual dampness that could penetrate bedding. A damp bed in freezing temperatures was potentially lethal. While the warming pan does its work, other preparations continue. Hot stones wrapped in cloth are being placed at the foot of the bed. These aren't the smooth river rocks you might imagine. They're specially selected stones from the kitchen fires, often made of soapstone or granite that retains heat exceptionally well. "These will stay warm till morning," says a servant, placing one carefully at the foot of the bed. "Mind your feet, though. They've burned many a toe." Wait, there's more. A small brazier of coals might be positioned near, but not too near, the bed, providing ambient heat for the room. In the most luxurious castles, this brazier might burn special woods or even exotic incense to mask the ever-present smell of smoke and dampness. "Apple wood burns clean," notes the steward, "but oak lasts longer. Your father preferred oak." Oh, and we can't forget the foot warmer, a small wooden box with a perforated lid and handles, inside which hot coals would be placed. This would be positioned under the covers at the foot of the bed, creating a warm spot for cold feet. "The Countess of Warwick lost 2 toes to the cold last winter," whispers one servant to another. "Turned black, they did. The physician cut them right off." This wasn't uncommon. Frostbite was a real danger, even indoors. Extremities, fingers, toes, ears, noses were particularly vulnerable. That's why warming the bed wasn't just about comfort. It was about preventing actual physical harm. Now comes another crucial part of the bedtime preparation: hot drinks. A servant arrives with a steaming cup. "Mulled wine, my lord, with cinnamon and cloves." This wasn't just a pleasant nightcap. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, creating a sensation of warmth, though actually cooling you faster in the long run, something medieval people didn't understand. The spices were believed to have warming properties according to medieval medicine. Whether scientifically valid or not, the psychological comfort of something hot before bed shouldn't be underestimated. With the bed prepared, it's time for you to get ready. And here's where medieval bedtime rituals diverge dramatically from modern ones. First, you wouldn't change into pajamas or a nightgown. Those weren't common until much later. Instead, most medieval nobles actually slept naked or in a simple linen shift. Wait, naked in freezing temperatures? I asked an historian specializing in medieval daily life. "Counterintuitive, isn't it?" she replied, "but it makes sense when you consider the full system. Skin-to-skin contact was warmer when sharing a bed, and clothes could trap dampness against the body, which was dangerous. Speaking of sharing, beds were rarely occupied by just one person. Even the lord and lady of the castle would likely sleep together, not just for marital reasons, but for vital warmth. In particularly cold weather, a trusted servant might even sleep at the foot of the noble's bed, adding another source of body heat. The Duchess of Norfolk had 3 ladies sleep in her bed during the winter of 1408, explains the historian, one at her feet and one on either side. It was considered an honour, not an imposition. Body heat was a resource in medieval winters, too valuable to waste on private sleeping arrangements. Now, with the bed warmed, the hot stones in place, and the curtains ready to be drawn, there's one more crucial element to medieval bedroom survival: the nightcap. And I don't mean the drink. "Always cover your head, my lord," advises your manservant, offering a knitted wool cap. "You lose most of your heat through your skull. While the specific percentage of heat lost through your head has been debated by modern science, the principle is sound. An uncovered head in a cold environment leads to significant heat loss. Medieval people understood this intuitively and rarely went to bed without head covering in winter." As you settle into bed, the servants draw the heavy curtains around you, enclosing you in your fabric cocoon. The transformation is immediate and remarkable. Inside this enclosed space, it's noticeably warmer already as your body heat begins to warm the small air pocket, rather than being lost to the vast, freezing room. The hot stones radiate warmth near your feet. The bed, elevated from the cold floor, has been dried and pre-warmed. The multiple layers of wool and fur blankets trap heat effectively, and as your body warms this enclosed space, the temperature becomes, if not comfortable by modern standards, at least survivable. "Will there be anything else, my lord?" asks the servant from beyond the curtain. "No, see that the fire is banked for the morning." This is another key element of nighttime survival, making sure the chamber's main fire doesn't die out completely. Banking the fire, covering it with ashes to slow its burn while keeping the embers alive, meant it could be quickly revived in the morning without the difficult task of starting a new fire in freezing conditions. As the servants leave, taking the candles with them, another fire hazard and expensive to boot, you're left in near-total darkness, enclosed in your fabric survival pod. The only sounds are the wind howling outside, the occasional pop from the dying fire, and perhaps the scurrying of mice in the walls. Sleep was different then, a sleep historian once told me. People often woke in the middle of the night for an hour or two before returning to sleep. They called it first sleep and second sleep, and the waking period between was considered normal. This biphasic sleep pattern might have had survival value in freezing castles, allowing people to check fires, add warming stones, or simply move around to generate body heat before returning to bed for the second sleep cycle. Inside your curtained bed, you might be relatively protected, but what about everyone else in the castle? The survival strategies varied dramatically depending on one's station, and so did the chances of actually surviving the night. Take the lady's maid sleeping on a trundle bed, a low frame on wheels that could be pushed under the main bed during the day. She's benefiting from the room's fire, but has no bed curtains of her own. Instead, she layers every piece of clothing she owns, and perhaps sleeps with a warming stone at her feet if she's fortunate. We fought over the sleeping spots. An elderly woman who had worked as a castle servant in her youth told a Victorian historian, "Closest to the kitchen wall was best. The ovens kept it warm all night. But even with these preparations, the cold was relentless." Medieval writings are filled with accounts of the suffering caused by winter nights in stone castles. In the Chronicle of Jocelyn of Brakelond, a 12th century monk, he describes visiting a castle where the cold was so severe that it caused the wine to freeze in the cups and the water in the washing bowls to turn to ice even near the fire. Imagine drinking from a cup and finding the wine freezing to the rim. That was reality. When morning finally arrives, the temperature in the castle is often at its lowest. The fires have died down through the night, and the stone has been cooling for hours. This is the most dangerous time, when the body's core temperature is naturally at its lowest. The first servant to enter your chamber brings news along with the morning fire. "Old Walter didn't wake this morning, my lord. Found stiff in the guardroom." Deaths from cold, hypothermia as we now call it, were common enough in medieval winters to barely warrant mention. The old, the very young, the ill, they were particularly vulnerable, but even healthy adults could succumb if their nighttime survival systems failed. The four-poster bed with its tactical design was literally a life-saving technology, not a luxury. The warming pan with its hot coals was essential medical equipment. The layers of wool and fur were survival gear. As you emerge from your curtained sleeping fortress into the biting cold of the chamber, you're once again reminded that survival, not comfort, was the primary goal of medieval bedroom design. "Ready your warmest garments, my lord," advises your manservant. "The messenger says snow is falling heavily." While you may have survived the night in your carefully prepared bed, many in the castle weren't so fortunate, and today will bring its own challenges as the medieval battle against the cold continues. But the most fascinating aspect of this struggle isn't found in the Lord's chamber with its relative luxuries. To truly understand the ingenuity and resilience of medieval castle dwellers, we need to look at how the majority of the household, the servants, managed to survive their nightly battle with the deadly cold. Their strategies were different but no less clever, and in some ways more effective than those employed by their noble masters. Servants couldn't rely on expensive four-poster beds or personal warming pans, so they developed their own systems, often based on the principle that human warmth was the most reliable heat source of all. Servants slept like pups in a litter, described one medieval household account. Huddled together for warmth, 10 or 12 to a chamber. This communal approach to fighting the cold revealed an understanding that survival wasn't an individual achievement but a group effort, and nowhere was this more evident than in the servants' sleeping arrangements, which we'll explore next. As your manservant helps you dress for the day, layering woolen garments to trap heat close to your body, you hear the bustling of the castle coming to life. The bread ovens are being stoked in the kitchen, creating precious heat that the kitchen servants would have huddled near all night. The great hall below is being prepared for the day's activities, with fresh rushes laid on the floor to provide minimal insulation from the stone, and somewhere a gravedigger is breaking through the frozen ground to make room for old Walter, another victim of the medieval winter. In this environment, your bed wasn't just furniture, it was your nightly refuge in a world where the cold was actively trying to kill you, and for the servants of the castle, without access to such luxuries, survival required even more creative solutions. The kitchen at night was a different world. While the lord and lady retreated to their curtained four-poster beds with heated stones and warmed linens, the castle's servants faced their own battle against the killing cold. Their weapons, proximity, ingenuity, and each other. "Best spots behind the bread ovens," whispers Meg, a kitchen maid of 12 years, to the new boy who arrived last week. "Stone stays warm till morning, worth the extra mice." She's not wrong. The massive bread ovens built into the kitchen walls absorbed heat throughout the day of baking and radiated it slowly all night. The stone wall backing these ovens was prime sleeping territory, fought over through subtle servant hierarchies and quiet alliances. "Martin will break your fingers if you take his spot," she warns, nodding toward a burly man stirring a pot of pottage. "Been sleeping there since before you were born." The reality of servant life in medieval castles wasn't what most people imagine. There were no private servant quarters with neat little beds all in a row. For most of the lower-ranking staff, sleeping arrangements were makeshift, communal, and dictated by one overwhelming concern: don't freeze to death. I visited dozens of castle ruins as a graduate student, an archaeologist told me, and kept looking for the servants' bedrooms. Then I realised I was thinking like a modern person. They didn't have bedrooms, they had sleeping spots, often temporary ones. The Great Hall, the heart of castle activity during the day, transformed at night into a massive dormitory. Servants would unroll straw pallets or simple woolen mats on the floor, often near the central hearth that would hold embers through the night. But don't picture neat rows of sleeping servants. The reality was far more chaotic and, frankly, intimate. Court records from 1340 mention a complaint that 43 servants were sleeping in a hall built for 30, the archaeologist explained. They were practically piled on top of each other. This wasn't just overcrowding, it was survival. Human bodies generate heat, and, in the brutal cold of a medieval castle, that heat was too valuable to waste on personal space or privacy. They slept like a litter of puppies, a tour guide at Bodiam Castle once told me, all tangled together in heaps. The cold killed you if you got too proud about personal space. Unlike modern sensibilities about personal bubbles, medieval servants understood that body heat was a communal resource. Sleeping huddled together wasn't just normal, it was necessary. "We'd sleep 10 or 12 in a cluster," recalled an elderly woman interviewed in the 1920s, whose grandmother had been a castle servant. Head to foot, foot to head, all in a tangle, the younger ones in the middle, where it stayed warmest. This practice of group sleeping for warmth even had its own terminology. The Latin phrase dormire acervatim, literally to sleep in a heap, appears in medieval household accounts, acknowledging the practice as standard. But not all servants were equal in this nighttime democracy of survival. Hierarchies existed even in sleep. "Been here 6 years and still sleeping by the door," grumbles a thin man carrying firewood. "Need to marry someone who sleeps near the kitchen wall." Yes, servant sleeping positions were so valuable they factored into marriage considerations. A good sleeping spot could mean the difference between comfort and suffering, between health and illness, sometimes between life and death. The most coveted spots were against the kitchen walls, especially backing the bread ovens, near, but not too near, the great hall hearth, in the laundry rooms where large cauldrons of water had been heated all day, in the brewery where the fermentation process generated heat, above the stables where animal heat rose through the wooden floors. "The head cook gets the corner by the spice cabinet," Meg explains, pointing to a pallet that's clearly more substantial than the others. "Been there 30 years, has a feather pillow and everything." Status in the servant world wasn't just about day jobs and wages. It was about where you were permitted to lay your head at night. "Some never got used to it," says an older woman kneading dough. "Lady Eliza's maid came from a farm, cried every night for a month about sleeping with 20 others. By midwinter she was fighting for middle spot like everyone else." Wait, I can hear you thinking, didn't they have beds? Some did, but not what we'd recognise as proper beds. Higher-ranking servants like the steward might have a simple wooden platform to keep them off the floor. The most fortunate personal servants, like the Lord's manservant or the lady's maid, might have trundle beds, low frames on wheels that could be stored under the noble's bed during the day. But for most, the floor was their mattress, with only what padding they could gather. "When I started at the castle, I had nothing but my cloak to sleep on," says the older woman, flour dusting her forearms. "Saved bits of wool for a year to stuff my own pallet. Still use it 20 years on. Even the materials used for sleeping revealed the harsh inequality." While the Lord enjoyed feather mattresses and linen sheets, servants made do with straw pallets at best, often stuffed with whatever they could find: wool scraps, horsehair, dried moss or herbs. "Or lavender in mine," says a young girl proudly. "Keeps the fleas away, mostly." Speaking of fleas and lice, bedbugs and mice, they were unwelcome but inevitable bedfellows. This communal sleeping, while necessary for warmth, had its downsides in terms of hygiene and disease transmission. Court records from Winchester Castle note an outbreak of winter fever that killed 8 servants who slept in the same corner of the hall, a historian told me. Once illness entered these sleeping groups, it spread rapidly, but the alternative, sleeping alone in the cold, was often seen as the greater risk. Hypothermia killed more quickly than most contagions. As we follow Meg through her evening routine, we see another survival tactic unique to servants: strategic clothing management. "Never take off your clothes," she advises the new boy. "Wear everything you own. Take off the outer layer for work, put it back on for sleeping." Unlike the nobles, who often slept naked under their blankets, servants typically slept fully clothed, adding their day clothes as extra blankets rather than removing them. Some even slept in their shoes, partly for warmth, partly because good shoes were valuable and could be stolen. "My grandmother said they'd sleep with their shoes tied to their belts with twine," the elderly woman from the 1920s interview recalled. "Lose your shoes in winter, might as well cut your own throat." The preparations for bed had their own rhythm and rules. As kitchen work wound down for the evening, servants would begin claiming their spots, laying out whatever bedding they possessed. "Marta, your pallet's dripping again," calls the cook to a laundry maid. "Hang it by the fire or we'll all be sleeping in a puddle." Damp bedding was a constant concern. Servants who worked with water, laundry maids, scullery boys, brewers, often had chronically damp clothes and bedding, a dangerous condition in the freezing castle. These workers would take turns drying their pallets near the kitchen fire in the evenings, one more community ritual in the shared struggle against the cold. "We'd hang everything we could near the fires at night," recalled a former castle servant in a Victorian memoir. "The kitchen looked like market day, with all manner of clothes and bedding hanging from every hook and beam." This practical approach extended to other survival tactics. While nobles had warming pans and hot stones prepared by servants, the servants themselves developed their own heating methods. "See this?" Meg shows the new boy a rounded stone about the size of a small loaf. "Put it in the ashes when the baking's done. Wrap it in rags before bed. Keep it at your feet. Thank me later." These improvised bed warmers were critical technology for people without access to the luxury of purpose-made warming pans. Stones, bricks, even sand-filled cloth bags would be heated and taken to bed, often shared between several sleepers. "My sister and I shared one brick between us," says a scullery maid scrubbing at a pot. "Took turns putting it at our feet. When it cooled, we'd hug it to our chests for the last bit of warmth." Some servants developed specialized tools for their particular sleeping situations. Stable hands, who often slept above the horses to benefit from the rising animal heat, created night buckets, clay containers filled with hot coals and covered with pierced lids that could safely provide heat in the hay-filled environment of the stables. "Burn the stable down. You'll wish you'd frozen instead," warns the stable master. Lord William hanged 2 boys for starting a fire with their night bucket in 42. This was no idle threat. Castle fires were terrifying prospects, especially at night, and the tension between needing heat and fearing fire was constant. Servants found responsible for fires faced severe punishment, yet going without heat often wasn't survivable in the depths of winter. "Coldest night I remember," says the elderly cook, settling onto her privileged pallet in the kitchen corner, "was the Feast of St. Lucy, must be 30 years back. Found 3 kitchen boys dead by morning, blue as woad they were. After that, the Lord allowed us extra charcoal in December, no matter the cost." Death from cold was common enough that most castle servants had witnessed it firsthand. It shaped their behaviour, their social structures, and their nightly routines in ways modern people can barely comprehend. We think of hypothermia as something that happens to mountaineers or people lost in blizzards, a medical historian explained to me. For medieval castle dwellers, it was an indoor hazard, like us worrying about electrical fires or carbon monoxide. How did they recognise when someone was succumbing to the cold? They had their own terminology and warning signs. "Watch if someone gets too quiet," Meg tells the new boy. "If they stop shivering and say they feel warm suddenly, wake the cook. That's frost sleep starting." What she's describing in modern terms is the paradoxical undressing and mental confusion that precedes death from hypothermia. Medieval people recognized these signs without understanding the physiology behind them. They also recognized that certain people were more vulnerable. The very young, the elderly, the thin, and the ill were watched more carefully on the coldest nights. "Old Tom sleeps between the baker's boy and Wat the Strong," Meg explains, pointing to an elderly man settling onto a pallet. "Been that way since he turned 60. Best warmth spots for the oldest among us." This informal system of protection for the vulnerable reflects a community understanding of shared survival that went beyond individual comfort. And what happened when someone did begin to show signs of dangerous cold? Servants had their own emergency protocols. Strip them, put them skin to skin between the 2 strongest, the cook explains matter-of-factly when I ask. Wrap everyone in whatever blankets you have. Works more often than not, if you catch it early. This emergency sharing of body heat, sometimes involving 3 or 4 people piled together, was a life-saving technique employed without embarrassment or hesitation. Survival trumped all other concerns, but sometimes even these measures weren't enough, especially during the bitterest cold snaps or when provisions ran low. Winter of 86 was brutal, recalls the elderly cook, her voice dropping. 23 servants at Michaelmas, 17 by Easter. The cold took them one by one, nothing to be done. These winter death counts were recorded in household accounts alongside expenses for food and candles. The human cost of medieval life noted with the same bureaucratic precision as the price of salt or wine. As night falls fully across the castle, the kitchen finally grows quiet. The servants settle onto their pallets in practiced formations, the oldest and youngest toward the centre of the groups, the strongest on the outer edges. Bedding is arranged, shared and tucked. Bodies pressed together without self-consciousness, sharing the only reliable heat source available, each other. "Good night, and God keep you warm," murmurs the cook, the traditional servant blessing in winter months. In the darkness, someone begins to hum softly, an old tune about spring flowers and warm sunshine. Others join in, the quiet melody a contrast to the wind howling outside the kitchen walls. This too is part of survival, the comfort of community against the lonely cold. "My father sang that every winter night," whispers a voice in the darkness. Said it reminded him that cold wasn't forever. This is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of how medieval castle dwellers survived the winter nights, not just the physical strategies of shared warmth and careful sleeping arrangements, but the psychological adaptations that made the cold endurable. They told stories, an oral historian explained to me. Winter tales passed down, songs, prayers specific to cold weather. These weren't just entertainment, they were coping mechanisms, ways to normalize an experience that would break most modern people. As the kitchen settles into sleep, the new patterns of breathing and the occasional snore indicate that most have found some measure of rest, despite the cold that makes each exhale visible in the dim light of the banked fire. But not everyone in the castle has the luxury of sleep, even in these communal conditions. Beyond the kitchen walls, through the draughty corridors and up on the exposed ramparts, another group battles the cold with far fewer resources and no opportunity to huddle together for warmth. The night watchmen, standing guard in the most exposed parts of the castle, face the winter darkness alone, their story perhaps the most extreme testament to medieval cold endurance. "Pity the poor bastards on the wall tonight," mutters someone in the darkness of the kitchen. "Rather sleep with pigs than stand watch in this weather." And indeed, some servants did exactly that. Sleeping in the animal quarters was another survival strategy, particularly for those who cared for the animals. The body heat of horses, cows, pigs, and even chickens was too valuable to waste. "Stable lads had it best in winter, worst in summer," observes the cook. "Warm nights with the horse stink, or cool nights with the kitchen smoke. Each servant makes their choice." As we leave the servants settled in their communal sleeping arrangements, we can reflect on how different their experience was from the nobles in their curtained beds, yet how both groups, in their own ways, were engaged in the same fundamental battle against the cold. For the nobles, it was a battle fought with technology and servants, warming pans, bed curtains, and hot bricks prepared by others. For the servants, it was a battle fought through community and adaptation, shared body heat, strategic sleeping positions, and improvised warming tools. Both were fighting for the same prize, to wake up alive when morning came. But there was one group in the castle whose fight against the nightly cold was even more desperate, and whose suffering was perhaps the greatest of all, because while the nobles slept in their enclosed beds and the servants huddled together on their pallets, the night watchmen stood alone on the castle walls, exposed to the full fury of winter, with almost no protection at all. Their story is one of endurance at the very limits of human capability, and as the kitchen settles into uneasy sleep, these solitary figures begin their own night-long battle against the killing cold. "Pray for those on the wall," murmurs the cook, making the sign of the cross as she drifts towards sleep. For many a watchman has been found standing frozen at his post come morning. Her words hang in the frosty air, a reminder that even the servants' hard circumstances were a kind of privilege compared to what the night guards endured. But that's a story for another part of our journey through the frozen nights of medieval castle life. The wind on the castle walls is a living thing. It doesn't just blow, it hunts. It finds every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin. It steals your body heat faster than you can generate it. And for the night watchmen of medieval castles, this wind was both companion and enemy during the long, freezing hours of their duty. "Third watch is the worst," mutters Edwin, a grizzled veteran of 15 years on the walls. "Coldest time of night, just before dawn. Men die on third watch." He's not exaggerating. While the nobles slept in their curtained beds and servants huddled together in the kitchen, the night watchman faced the winter darkness alone, in the most exposed parts of the castle, with almost no protection from the killing cold. "Found Aldred frozen last winter," Edwin tells the young guard beside him, "still standing upright, eyes open, didn't even fall when he died." The young guard, Watt, swallows hard. It's his first winter on the walls, and at 19 he's already heard enough stories to know that the cold kills more watchmen than enemy arrows ever did. The job of a castle night watchman was brutally simple. Stay awake, stay alert, watch for approaching danger, and signal if anything suspicious appears. But accomplishing this in winter conditions that could literally freeze a man to death was anything but simple. "My grandfather was a night watchman at Warwick Castle," a medieval reenactor told me. "Family legend says he lost 3 toes and the tip of one ear to frostbite. They called him Notch for the rest of his life." Unlike modern security guards with heated guardhouses and warm clothing, medieval watchmen stood exposed on the castle battlements with only stone walls for shelter, walls that themselves radiated cold like icy bricks. "The stone steals your warmth," Edwin explains, stamping his feet on the walkway. "Stand still too long and you'll never move again." He demonstrates the watchman's walk, a constant movement, shifting weight from foot to foot, occasionally swinging arms against the body. This wasn't just restlessness, it was survival. Keeping blood flowing to the extremities was essential to prevent frostbite. "Never stop moving," he instructs Watt. "Even if you're tired, even if your legs ache, movement keeps you alive." The night watch typically operated in shifts. Most castles divided the night into 3 or 4 watches, with different men assigned to each. A watch could last anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, brief enough to be survivable in theory, long enough to be potentially deadly in practice. 4 hours in summer, 2 in winter, says Edwin. Lord's mercy, that. Used to be 4 hours year-round till 3 men died in 1 month. But the shift system itself created dangers. The transition between watches was a vulnerable time for the castle's security, and sleeping guards were difficult to wake in freezing conditions. "Some never wake," Edwin says grimly. "Fall asleep on watch in this weather. You might not get up again. Cold sleep becomes death sleep." The clothing of a night watchman was his primary defense against the cold, but it was far from adequate by modern standards. Let's look at what Edwin and Watt are wearing on this freezing night. First, linen undergarments covering the body from neck to ankle. Over that, 1 or 2 woolen tunics, the outer one perhaps lined with fur if the guard was fortunate. Woolen leggings and thick hose. Leather boots stuffed with straw for insulation. A woolen cloak, possibly lined with sheepskin. Woolen cap pulled down over the ears. Leather gloves if available. Many made do with cloth mittens or nothing at all. "Gloves are for rich men," Edwin says, showing his bare, reddened hands. "Can't feel the bell rope with gloves, can't feel the sword hilt." Medieval guards were caught in a deadly paradox. They needed maximum protection from the cold, but also needed to maintain combat readiness and manual dexterity for signalling. It was an impossible balance, and their hands and feet usually suffered for it. The trick is, look at your fingers every quarter hour, Edwin demonstrates, holding his hands up to the meagre light of a sheltered torch. If you can't feel them but they're still red, that's good. White patches mean trouble. Black means you'll lose them. This practical knowledge of frostbite symptoms was passed down from veteran guards to newcomers, vital survival information in an age without medical textbooks. But clothing alone wasn't enough. Guards developed additional strategies to survive the killing cold of their night watches. See this? Edwin pulls a small leather flask from inside his tunic. Pepper ale, burns the throat, warms the belly, doesn't dull the senses like wine. Various warming drinks were common among night watchmen. Unlike the nobles with their spiced wine, guards needed beverages that would warm without intoxicating. Hot ale mixed with pepper, ginger, or mustard seeds was common. Some guards swore by a mixture of hot water, vinegar, and honey. The steward gives each man a flask at the start of watch, Edwin explains. Empty when you report for duty, you'll be flogged. Keeps us from drinking it all at once. These warming drinks weren't just for comfort, they were survival tools. The brief internal warmth they provided could make the difference between maintaining vigilance and succumbing to the cold-induced drowsiness that often preceded death. Another survival tool was the watchfire, though these were controversial. Small braziers or firepots were sometimes allowed at strategic points along the battlements, but they came with serious drawbacks. Fire makes you a target, Edwin says, nodding to a small brazier sputtering in a sheltered corner of the wall walk. Shows the enemy exactly where you're standing, and the light ruins your night vision. Even worse, the contrast between the fire's heat and the freezing air could be dangerous in itself. Warm your hands, then grip cold stone or metal, skin sticks and tears, Edwin warns. Better to stay evenly cold than go back and forth. Despite these risks, watchfires were sometimes the only thing keeping guards alive during the bitterest nights. Castle records from medieval England include regular expenditures for watchman's coal during winter months, suggesting that the security risk was deemed worth taking. Lord William allows 3 braziers on the east wall from Martinmas to Candlemas, Edwin says. No more. Says we'd burn the castle down if he gave us more. Beyond these official provisions, night watchmen developed their own ingenious methods for generating heat. Small heated stones carried in pockets, bags of oats heated before watch and tucked inside clothing, even bags of hot sand that would conform to the body and release heat slowly. Some men piss in their boots, Edwin confides with a grimace. Warm for a moment, misery after. I don't recommend it. This desperate measure speaks to the extreme conditions these men endured. Unlike the servants who could share body heat or the nobles with their bed warmers, night watchmen faced the cold in essential isolation even when multiple guards were on duty together. Can't huddle together on watch, Edwin explains. Need to face different directions, cover all approaches, cold winds when men bunch up. The practical requirements of their duty prevented the most effective cold-fighting strategy available to other castle dwellers, communal body heat. This isolation made their struggle against the cold particularly acute. My feet haven't been truly warm from November to March in 15 years, Edwin says matter-of-factly. You get used to it, or you die. The casual way he refers to death reveals much about the watchman's relationship with mortality. Records from various medieval castles suggest that death on night watch was common enough to be an expected occupational hazard, particularly among the elderly or infirm assigned to guard duty. At Norwich Castle in 1412, 4 night watchmen were found dead at their posts after a particularly cold night, a medieval historian told me. The castle steward simply noted the expense of replacing them, as one might record the cost of broken equipment. The human cost of castle security was rarely factored into the calculations of those who slept safely inside. But the night watchmen themselves developed a culture of mutual protection, watching out for each other when possible. Check on the old ones, Edwin tells Watt. Thomas on the North Tower is 60 if he's a day. Look for him every half hour. If he's sitting, wake him. Sitting is dying in this cold. The most vulnerable were supposed to be excused from winter night duty, but reality often differed from policy. Old soldiers, those who had served the Lord for decades, frequently found themselves assigned to the walls regardless of their fitness for the task. No one wants night watch, Edwin says, but the Lord needs eyes on the walls, and we all serve or suffer. Not all watchmen were created equal, however. Their equipment and conditions varied dramatically depending on the castle's wealth and the Lord's concern for security. In the wealthiest castles, night watchmen might have small guard rooms built into the wall, tiny stone chambers with narrow windows for observation and small hearths for warmth. These watchmen could rotate between observation and warming themselves, a luxury that significantly reduced cold-related deaths. Heard Windsor has guard rooms with actual braziers inside, Edwin says with naked envy. King's men don't stand in the wind like we do. Other castles provided special winter equipment for their guards. Accounts from the Tower of London mention watch cloaks made of multiple layers of wool, with an outer layer treated with wax for water resistance. Some lords provided fur-lined boots, or even crude mittens that could be worn over the guard's sword hand and removed quickly if needed. But Edwin and Watt have none of these luxuries. Their lord is of middling wealth, and the castle's provisions for its watchmen are basic at best. Take this, Edwin says, handing Watt a flat stone about the size of a small loaf of bread. Keep it inside your tunic, against your belly. Won't stay warm long, but better than nothing. The stone had been sitting near a brazier and radiates a modest heat. This small comfort carried close to the core of the body might make a life or death difference during the long hours ahead. As the night deepens, the temperature drops further. Watt's breath hangs in clouds before his face, and the metal of his sword hilt becomes painful to touch. The stone against his belly has long since gone cold. Worst time now, Edwin murmurs, looking east where no hint of dawn yet lightens the sky. Bodies at its lowest. Suns far away. Dead time. Medical science has since confirmed what these guards knew from experience. The body's core temperature naturally drops to its lowest point in the hours before dawn, making this the most dangerous time for those exposed to extreme cold. Men die in the third watch, Edwin repeats his earlier warning. Stay awake, keep moving. To combat the deadly drowsiness that cold induces, watchmen developed various techniques. Some carried small pouches of pungent herbs, rosemary, mint, or even crushed garlic, to sniff when alertness waned. Others pinched themselves regularly or pricked their hands with knife points to stay conscious. When your mind starts to wander, bite your tongue, Edwin advises. Pain keeps death away. Perhaps the most effective strategy was conversation. Guards would talk constantly when conditions were at their worst, asking each other questions that required responses, telling stories that needed reactions. Tell me about your village, Edwin commands Watt. Every detail, the baker's name, the colour of the tavern door. This wasn't just passing time, it was monitoring each other's mental state. Slurred speech or confusion could be early signs of dangerous cold exposure, what modern medicine calls hypothermia, but medieval guards simply called frost taken. If I stop making sense, Edwin says, slap me hard and call for the next watch early. Rather face the steward's anger than the death chill. The camaraderie between watchmen was built on this mutual dependence for survival. Despite different ages and backgrounds, they formed bonds forged in the shared struggle against the cold. My cousin was a night watchman at Kenilworth, the medieval reenactor told me. He said they had a saying. Summer friends are many, winter watchmen are few, but true. Those who survived multiple winters on the walls developed a kind of pride in their endurance, wearing their suffering as a badge of honour. City guards have it easy, Edwin sniffs dismissively. Inn to inn, always near a tavern fire, castle watchmen are the real men. This professional pride helped sustain them through the brutal conditions, creating meaning in their suffering, but it didn't make the cold any less deadly. As the hours crawl by, Watt begins to experience what all night watchmen dreaded, the seductive pull of cold-induced sleep. His eyelids grow heavy, his thoughts sluggish. The cold no longer feels so bitter. In fact, he feels almost warm now. Watt, Edwin's sharp voice and a stinging slap bring him back. "Your eyes were closing. Talk to me. Count the stars if you have to." What Watt was experiencing was the dangerous euphoria that often precedes freezing to death, the body's final surrender to the cold. Edwin recognized the signs because he had seen them before in men who never woke again. "The danger isn't feeling cold," Edwin explains urgently. "It's when you stop feeling cold. When the shivers stop and warmth seems to come from nowhere, that's death approaching." This practical knowledge of hypothermia symptoms, gained through brutal experience rather than medical training, was vital survival information passed from veteran to novice. The psychological challenges of night watch were as formidable as the physical ones. Isolation, darkness, and the constant discomfort created a mental battlefield that claimed many victims. "Mind plays tricks in the cold dark," Edwin says, squinting at a distant shadow. "See things that aren't there, hear voices in the wind." Cold-induced hallucinations were common enough to have their own terminology among medieval guards: frost visions or winter's whispers. The challenge was distinguishing between dangerous delusions and real threats. "If you're not sure, ring the small bell," Edwin instructs, pointing to a bell mounted near their position. "Brings the sergeant, but not the whole castle. Better a false alarm than a missed warning." The castle's security system had evolved to account for the effects of cold on its human components, building in redundancies and check systems to compensate for the guards' compromised reliability in extreme conditions. As the night inches toward dawn, Watt and Edwin complete their watch without further incidents. Their replacements arrive, stamping and blowing into cupped hands, their expressions grim as they prepare for their own battle with the cold. "Made it through another," Edwin says with gruff satisfaction as they descend the stone stairs toward the relative warmth of the castle interior. "Another night cheated the Reaper." This was how success was measured on the winter watch, not by enemies spotted or alerts raised, but simply by survival until the changing of the guard. Inside, they head directly to the kitchen, where the earliest servants are already starting the day's fires. The watchmen are given a privilege earned through their suffering: first claim to the kitchen hearth. "Stand back. Give them room," orders the head cook, shooing away others as Edwin and Watt approach the growing fire. Nightmen get the flames first. This tradition, giving night watchmen priority access to morning warmth, was common in many castles. It acknowledged the extreme conditions these men endured and provided a reward for their service. But the warming process itself was dangerous. Frostbitten extremities could be damaged further by sudden heat, and the pain of circulation returning to half-frozen limbs was excruciating. "Don't put your hands or feet too close," Edwin warns, demonstrating how to rotate before the fire, warming gradually. Quick heat cripples. Seen men lose fingers that survived the cold only to be ruined by the fire. As they slowly warm, Edwin inspects Watt's hands and face for signs of frostbite. Finding none, he nods with approval. "You'll do," he says simply. "Rest now. We go back at sunset." And that was the final cruel reality of the night watchman's existence. The brief respite of daylight hours would pass all too quickly, and darkness would bring another battle with the cold, night after night, week after week, through the long months of winter. This cycle of endurance shaped these men in ways that's hard for us to imagine today. Their bodies adapted, developing greater cold tolerance, changing circulation patterns to protect core temperature at the expense of extremities. Their minds adapted too, learning to function through discomfort that would incapacitate most modern people. People ask if I'm afraid of the dark, an elderly security guard who worked winter nights once told me. I laugh. Darkness isn't the enemy. Cold is. Cold kills silently, patiently. Cold never gives up. Edwin would have understood this sentiment perfectly, as would the countless unnamed night watchmen who stood their posts through medieval winters, fighting not just external enemies, but the more immediate threat of the freezing darkness itself. As Watt collapses onto his pallet in the guard's quarters, too exhausted even to remove his boots, he knows he's passed a test of sorts. He survived his first deep winter night on the walls, but winter is long and many nights remain before spring brings relief. "Rest while you can," says another guard, already snoring before he finishes the sentence. For now, both Edwin and Watt have survived the deadly cold that claimed so many of their predecessors, but the night will come again, and with it the eternal battle against the cold that defined the night watchman's existence. This was the reality of medieval castle life in winter, a multi-layered struggle for survival that played out differently depending on one's station, from the lord in his curtained bed to the servants huddled together to the watchman facing the elements alone. Each fought the cold with whatever tools and strategies their position afforded them. But there were times when even the best preparations weren't enough, when winter tightened its grip beyond normal expectations, when provisions ran low, or when unexpected crises arose. Even the relatively privileged inhabitants of the castle found themselves at death's door. These winter emergencies tested medieval ingenuity to its limits and sometimes pushed castle dwellers to extreme measures in their quest to survive until spring. The winter of 1395 was remembered for generations, not as the coldest on record, though it certainly qualified, but as the winter that wouldn't end. March came and went with no thaw. April arrived with fresh snow. By early May, when spring should have been well established, ice still crusted the castle moat each morning. We called it the Endless Winter. An entry in the Warwick Castle Steward's account reads, "Provisions meant for 3 months stretched to 5. God's mercy alone prevented us from eating the dogs." Extreme winters like this pushed medieval castle dwellers beyond their normal survival strategies. When the cold persisted beyond all expectations, when food stores dwindled, when fuel became scarce, that's when true desperation set in, and with it, measures that reveal just how precarious life in a medieval castle could be. "My lord, the coal store is down to a quarter sack," reports the steward, his face grave. "The woodpile won't last 3 days at current use." The lord of the castle, huddled near the great hall's fire in layers of fur, nods grimly. He's been expecting this news for weeks. "Implement the winter protocols," he says quietly. "May God forgive us." The winter protocols. Every well-run castle had them, though they were rarely discussed openly and even more rarely implemented. They were the emergency measures, the last resorts, the brutal calculations of survival when normal methods failed. First step was always consolidation, a castle historian explained to me, abandoning parts of the castle to concentrate warmth in fewer spaces. This meant closing off entire sections, towers, halls, even whole wings, to focus limited heating resources on a few critical areas. For castle dwellers accustomed to already cramped quarters, this created unprecedented crowding. By February's end, we had 63 people sleeping in the Great Hall, reads an account from Kenilworth Castle during a 14th century winter crisis. The stench was ungodly, but none dared sleep apart for fear of the cold. This consolidation wasn't just about shared body heat, though that was certainly a factor. It was also about fuel efficiency, heating one space adequately rather than many spaces poorly. We moved the Lord's family from the tower bedroom to chambers adjacent to the kitchen, the castle steward recalls, making notes in the household account. Dignity sacrificed for survival. That was a radical step. Medieval nobility defined themselves through physical separation from commoners. For a lord to abandon his private chambers and sleep in proximity to servants represented a profound disruption of the social order, one accepted only in the most extreme circumstances. My grandfather told a story about the winter of 42, an elderly villager shared with a Victorian folklorist, said the lord and lady slept in the kitchen itself on pallets no better than the servants. Cold makes equals of everyone, he said. This social levelling effect of extreme winter was temporary but significant. Castle inhabitants who normally lived in strictly segregated worlds found themselves sharing space, resources and survival knowledge. Lady Eleanor learned to knit from the kitchen maids that winter, a lady-in-waiting's diary recalls, said she'd rather have warm fingers than clean ones, shocking to hear a noblewoman speak so. But warm fingers were no small matter when frostbite threatened. During extreme winters, the strictures of propriety loosened by necessity. Ladies who would normally never engage in manual labour found themselves learning practical skills from servants. Lords who would normally delegate all physical tasks took turns carrying firewood. The young lord chopped wood alongside the stable boys, notes a surprised entry in a castle account. His hands blistered and bled, but he did not stop until darkness fell. Beyond consolidation of space, castles implemented strict rationing of essential resources, primarily fuel and food. These rationing systems reveal much about medieval priorities and power structures. Fuel was allocated by rank, but with minimums for all, explained a historian specialising in medieval household management. Even in the most desperate times, castle administrators understood that letting servants freeze to death was ultimately self-defeating. The rationing system typically looked something like this. The lord's family received enough fuel to maintain one fire in their consolidated living space. Essential staff, the steward, key knights, the marshal, received fuel for a small brazier in their sleeping quarters. Common servants received no individual allocation, but benefited from the kitchen fires and consolidated sleeping arrangements. Night watchmen received a slightly increased allocation for braziers on the walls, acknowledging the extreme conditions they faced. Coal goes first to the watchfires, then the kitchen, then the great hall, orders the steward in our castle. No private chambers to receive fuel until further notice. Food rationing followed similar principles, but with important differences. While nobles might accept reduced comfort, they rarely accepted reduced nutrition. Food rationing typically preserved the quality of nobles' meals while drastically reducing quantity for everyone. The lord's table receives 1/3 less meat, servants half their normal bread, the steward calculates, scratching figures on a piece of parchment. Castle guards maintain full rations. Men standing watch in this cold need their strength. This pragmatic approach to rationing recognised that different roles in the castle required different levels of sustenance. Those performing physical labour in the cold, particularly the night watchman, needed more calories simply to survive their duties. Guard found dead this morning wasn't killed by cold alone, the castle physician remarks grimly. Man was skin and bones beneath his cloak, can't fight winter on an empty stomach. When normal rationing wasn't enough, castle dwellers turned to increasingly desperate measures to generate heat and preserve food. This is where medieval ingenuity truly reveals itself. "Bring me every piece of furniture not currently in use," orders the steward. Chairs, tables, decorative screens, anything made of wood. Sacrificing furniture for firewood was a drastic step that indicated severe crisis. Furniture in medieval castles was valuable and relatively scarce. To deliberately destroy it for fuel meant that survival concerns had completely trumped economic considerations. First went the old trestle tables from the feast hall, recalls a servant from a particularly desperate winter. Then the benches. By March, the lord authorised cutting up the great oak wardrobe that had been his grandmother's wedding chest. I saw Lady Anne weep as they took the axe to it. But furniture was just the beginning. As winter crises deepened, castle dwellers found fuel in increasingly unlikely places. "We burned the decorative timbers from the chapel ceiling," admits a castle chaplain in a confessional letter, "prayed for forgiveness even as we fed God's house to the flames. What choice remained? The children were turning blue with cold. Old linens, tapestries too worn to sell, broken tools, unused door frames, even floorboards from abandoned sections of the castle, all eventually found their way into fires during the most desperate times." Record here, third stair of North Tower dismantled for fuel, notes a steward's account with bureaucratic precision, to be rebuilt in spring if God grants us to see it. When conventional fuel sources were exhausted, castle dwellers turned to alternatives that reveal how desperate their situation had become. Mix 1 part rendered fat with 2 parts dried horse dung and 1 part straw, instructs an elderly servant to younger staff. Press into cakes and dry near the fire. Burn slow and hot when no wood remains. These improvised fuel cakes were a technology born of necessity, not as effective as wood or coal, but capable of providing critical heat when nothing else was available. Similar improvised fuels have been documented in various cultures facing extreme conditions, from Himalayan communities to Arctic indigenous groups. "Smells unholy," complains a night squire, wrinkling his nose as the fuel cakes burn, "but better than freezing to death." The smell was indeed a downside, one more indignity in a season full of them. But as the old medieval saying went, cold noses smell nothing. When survival was at stake, comfort concerns like pleasant odours became irrelevant. Even more extreme than burning furniture or making dung cakes was the practice of bringing livestock inside the castle walls, and sometimes inside the castle itself. "Bring the milk cows into the inner bailey," orders the castle steward as another snowstorm threatens. "The pigs and chickens into the old storage room off the kitchen. We need their heat more than we need cleanliness now." This wasn't just about preserving valuable animals from freezing to death, though that was certainly a consideration. It was also about harnessing their body heat to help warm human inhabitants. "We slept with the chickens," admits a kitchen maid, almost embarrassed at the memory. "A dozen of us servant girls in the hen house, feathers and filth everywhere, but warm enough to live through the night." In the most desperate situations, animals were brought directly into human living spaces. Records from several medieval castles mention cows and horses being stabled in great halls during extreme weather, a practice that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "The young calves were kept in the Lord's antechamber," recalls a dairymaid from a particularly harsh winter. "Lady Margaret herself tended them, said they were too valuable to lose, and their breath kept the connecting rooms warmer. A cow's body heat output is roughly equivalent to a 1 kilowatt heater, significant warmth in an unheated stone space." Medieval people understood this value intuitively, if not scientifically. The practice of sharing living space with animals during extreme cold has parallels across many pre-industrial cultures. Mongolian herders traditionally brought baby animals into their yurts during harsh weather. Alpine farmers often built their homes with the stable on the ground floor, allowing the animal heat to rise and warm human quarters above. "My grandmother said during the terrible winter of 1407 they kept the bees inside," recounts an elderly beekeeper. "Hives in the great hall corners. Sounds mad, but she swore it, said they were drowsy from the cold and caused no trouble, while the hive warmth helped, if only a little." Whether this particular account is accurate or exaggerated, it speaks to the psychological impact of these winter crises. They remained in cultural memory as times when normal rules were suspended and survival trumped all other concerns. Beyond physical strategies for generating heat, medieval castle dwellers also employed social adaptations during winter emergencies. One of the most significant was the adjustment of daily schedules. "Winter hours now in effect," announces the steward as the crisis deepens. "All rise at first light, all to bed at dusk, no exceptions save the night watch." This compressed schedule maximised daylight hours when temperatures were marginally higher and minimised the need for artificial light and additional heating during the coldest part of the day. It also meant people spent more time in bed, up to 14 or 16 hours during the shortest winter days. "We didn't sleep all those hours," explains an elderly woman who had served as a lady's maid. "Couldn't possibly, but we stayed abed, several to a mattress, sharing warmth, better than sitting up in the cold burning precious fuel." This extended bedtime wasn't just about physical warmth, it also helped conserve calories. People at rest burn fewer calories than people engaged in activity, an important consideration when food stores were dwindling. The psychological toll of these extreme winters can't be overstated. Contemporary accounts describe the mental strain of prolonged cold, darkness, crowding, and hunger. By the 6th week of snow, melancholy overtook the household, writes a castle chaplain. Men quarrelled over trifles. Women wept without cause. The children grew listless. I prescribed prayer, but in truth, my own faith wavered as the cold persisted. To combat this psychological strain, castle communities developed structured activities specifically for winter crises. These weren't just diversions, they were deliberate strategies to maintain morale and social cohesion under extreme stress. "Story circles by rotation," orders the steward, "each person to speak in turn, sharing tales, memories or songs, none excused from lord to scullery boy." These structured social activities served multiple purposes. They reinforced community bonds at a time when tensions ran high. They passed knowledge between generations. And perhaps most importantly, they provided psychological escape from the immediate hardships. "My father said those story circles saved his mind during the endless winter," recounts a man whose ancestor had served as a castle guard. Said after weeks of cold and hunger, the stories were the only warmth that truly mattered. Some castles formalized these activities into a specific winter emergency role, the keeper of tales or winter speaker. This person was responsible for maintaining the story rotation and sometimes contributing more elaborate narratives to boost morale. "Martha knows more tales than any 3 people combined," notes the steward, assigning an elderly cook's assistant to the role. "She'll organize the evening tellings for the duration." This recognition of morale as essential to survival reflects a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that we sometimes fail to credit to medieval people. They may not have had our scientific vocabulary, but they understood that the mind could kill or save as surely as the body. Religious practices also intensified during winter crises. While medieval life was already steeped in religious observance, extreme winters brought special rituals and prayers specific to cold weather survival. "Thrice daily prayers to St. Benedict the Snow Turner," instructs the castle chaplain, "all to attend without excuse." St. Benedict wasn't actually known as the Snow Turner in official church doctrine, but local traditions often assigned specialized roles to saints based on community needs. In this case, a regional tradition had designated Benedict as particularly effective at ending persistent winter weather. Other winter-specific religious practices included the blessing of fuel stores, special candle-lighting rituals on particular feast days, and in some cases, processions around the castle walls carrying relics believed to have weather-influencing properties. "We walked the walls with St. Oswald's tooth," remembers an elderly woman, describing a winter ritual from her childhood in a northern castle. "Chaplain led us, lords and scullery maids alike, all singing the Thor prayers. Next day wasn't warmer, but we felt better for trying." The psychological benefit of these rituals likely outweighed any meteorological impact, but that didn't make them less valuable to the people performing them. They provided structure, hope, and a sense of agency during circumstances that otherwise left people feeling powerless. As winter emergencies stretched from days into weeks and sometimes months, castle inhabitants faced the grim task of determining who would receive increasingly scarce resources, decisions that reveal much about medieval values and power structures. "The old and infirm to receive double blankets but half rations," orders the steward, making the brutal calculation that those who moved least needed more warmth but could survive on less food than active workers. children and pregnant women to receive milk daily, even as others go without, states another directive, prioritizing the future of the community over present comfort for all. These decisions weren't made lightly, and castle accounts sometimes record heated debates among leadership about the most ethical way to distribute dwindling supplies. The marshal argued that guards should receive preferential treatment as the castle's security depended on them, notes one such account. The chaplain countered that the youngest children should be prioritized as most vulnerable. The Lord heard both and ruled night watchmen and children under 5 to receive full rations, all others reduced by 1/3. These were the survival ethics of medieval crisis management, pragmatic but not without compassion, hierarchical but with recognition of special vulnerability and essential roles. Perhaps the most extreme measure recorded during winter crises was the practice of warm sleeping, a rotation system that ensured the most vulnerable castle inhabitants always had access to the warmest sleeping spots. Implement the 3-shift sleeping arrangement, orders the steward when the cold becomes life-threatening. 8 hours by thirds, beds never empty. This meant that beds, particularly those in relatively warmer locations, were used continuously, with different people sleeping in them in rotation throughout the 24-hour cycle. As one person rose to work, another immediately took their place in the still warm bedding. Strange to sleep in the Lord's daughter's bed while she was at her lessons, recalls a servant girl from one such crisis. Stranger still to know that when I rose, the cook's boy would take my place, but the arrangement kept us alive. This practice upended normal social boundaries and hygiene standards, but it maximized the utility of limited warm sleeping spots. Body heat was too precious a resource to waste on empty beds during the coldest hours. Even more extreme were the designated warm rooms, spaces where temperature was maintained at survivable levels at all costs, even as the rest of the castle was abandoned to the cold. The south solar is now the warm room, announces the steward, all fuel to be directed there. Those not on essential duty will shelter there when not working. These warm rooms functioned as community lifeboats, places where the most vulnerable could retreat when conditions elsewhere became life-threatening. Unlike modern warming centres, which typically operate during daylight hours, castle warm rooms often operated continuously during the worst weather. We kept the solar at living temperature for 11 days without break, records a proud steward after a particularly brutal cold snap. Burned every spare timber, but lost not a single soul to the cold. God be praised. The effort required to maintain these spaces was enormous. Servants worked in shifts to keep fires burning continuously. Precious fuel was diverted from other uses. Tapestries, screens, and makeshift partitions were arranged to prevent heat loss. These rooms represented medieval crisis management at its most resource-intensive. In the most extreme cases, when fuel was critically scarce, castle inhabitants resorted to what records euphemistically call the living circle, a last-ditch survival method based entirely on shared body heat. When no fuel remained, we sat in the circle day and night, recounts a survivor of one such crisis. Old and young, noble and common, pressed together back to back, side to side, changing positions hourly so none grew too cold on the outside edge, speaking in turns to stay awake, praying for the thaw. This practice, dozens of people sitting in tight formation conserving collective body heat, was the final defense against lethal cold when all other options had failed. Archaeological evidence suggests it wasn't uncommon. Several medieval sites show unusual wear patterns on floor stones, consistent with large groups sitting in circular formations during specific periods associated with extreme weather events. As our castle endures its winter crisis, we see all these measures implemented in succession, from the initial consolidation and rationing to the increasingly desperate fuel alternatives to the final social adaptations that prioritized collective survival over individual comfort or status. "3 weeks now in the warm room," notes a weary lady-in-waiting in her diary. Lady Anne sits shoulder to shoulder with the kitchen maids. Lord William takes his turn tending the fire like any common man. The chaplain says God is teaching us humility. If so, the lesson is well learned. The crisis revealed both the fragility and the resilience of medieval castle life. These stone fortresses, so imposing in their strength against human enemies, proved vulnerable to winter's assault, yet the communities within them developed sophisticated, multi-layered strategies for survival that combined physical, social, and psychological adaptations. As the endless winter of 1395 finally began to loosen its grip, castle inhabitants emerged from their ordeal forever changed by the experience. Social barriers, temporarily lowered by necessity, never quite returned to their former rigidity. Survival knowledge, shared across class lines, became part of the castle's collective wisdom, and the memory of how close they had come to disaster instilled a new respect for winter's power. "Never again shall we enter November with less than full wood stores," vows the steward, making notes for the coming year. "The cold is a more dangerous enemy than any army." This hard-won wisdom would be passed down through generations, becoming part of the castle's institutional memory and preparation protocols. The extreme winter had taught lessons that would influence castle life for decades to come. As the first true spring day finally arrives, with warmth that penetrates even the thick stone walls, the castle community emerges from survival mode. The abandoned sections are reopened, cleaned, and repaired. The animals return to their proper places outside the living quarters. The rationing systems are gradually relaxed. "First day without frost on the inner walls," notes a servant with profound relief. "Perhaps we'll live to see summer after all." This cautious optimism reflected the medieval relationship with seasonal change, never taking survival for granted, always aware that nature could turn against humanity with deadly force. The lessons learned during these extreme winter crises would evolve over centuries into more sophisticated heating technologies, better insulation methods, and more efficient fuel use. The desperate improvisations of medieval castle dwellers contained the seeds of innovations that would eventually make winter survival less precarious for future generations. But for those who lived through these crises, the knowledge was more immediate and personal. They had faced winter at its most brutal and survived through a combination of preparation, adaptation, and community cohesion. Their experiences reveal a side of medieval castle life rarely depicted in romantic portrayals, one where the greatest enemy wasn't the opposing army or the plotting rival, but the silent, creeping cold that threatened everyone regardless of rank or status. As we leave our castle emerging from its winter ordeal, we can reflect on what these extreme survival measures tell us about medieval priorities, ingenuity, and resilience. The strategies they developed, from four-poster beds to fuel rationing to social reorganization, were sophisticated responses to environmental challenges that tested human endurance to its limits. Their struggle against the cold shaped not just how they lived through winter, but how they designed, built, and organized their world year-round. The legacy of that struggle can still be seen in the architecture, technology, and cultural practices that evolved from their hard-won experience. Dawn breaks over the castle walls. Sunlight catches on frost-covered stone, turning battlements into glittering crystal sculptures. After months of bitter cold, the first true hint of spring warms the air. A night watchman, finishing his shift, pauses to turn his face toward the strengthening sun. "Made it through another winter," he murmurs, something like wonder in his voice. This simple statement carries more weight than modern ears might recognize. Surviving winter in a medieval castle wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't assumed. It was an achievement, sometimes a daily battle against an enemy that claimed countless lives each year. "They didn't just endure winter," a medieval historian once told me, warming her hands around a mug of coffee in her modern heated office. They actively fought it with every tool and technique at their disposal, and they remembered the ones who lost that fight. The techniques we've explored throughout our journey, from four-poster beds with their tactical curtains to communal servant sleeping to the desperate measures of extreme weather, weren't just interesting historical curiosities. They were survival technologies developed and refined through generations of trial, error, and sometimes deadly consequences. My research suggests that winter deaths in medieval castles could reach 5 to 10% of the household in particularly harsh years, the historian explained. Higher among the elderly and very young, of course, lower among those with access to better warming methods. These casualties weren't just accepted as inevitable. Each death prompted refinements in survival strategies, adjustments to protocols, new innovations in heating and insulation. Medieval people weren't passive victims of their environment. They were active problem solvers, constantly adapting to challenges that threatened their existence. A good example of this adaptive innovation can be seen in the evolution of the bed warmer. Early medieval nobles might have used simple heated stones wrapped in cloth, effective but dangerous, easily causing burns or fires. By the late medieval period, purpose-made warming pans had developed with long handles for safety and perforated lids to prevent bedding from scorching. They didn't have our technology, an architectural historian explained while showing me through a restored castle bedroom, but they had centuries of accumulated practical knowledge about heat transfer, insulation, and thermal efficiency. They just conceptualized it differently than we do. This practical knowledge shaped not just winter survival tactics, but the entire design and operation of medieval castles. The placement of kitchens, the arrangement of sleeping quarters, the thickness of walls, the size and position of windows, all reflected lessons learned through bitter experience about managing cold. Notice how the servants' quarters were positioned above the kitchen in this castle, the architectural historian pointed out. That wasn't random. Heat rises. The kitchen fires kept those rooms marginally warmer than they would have been elsewhere. Medieval builders understood thermal dynamics through experience, not equations. This principle of practical knowledge applied to clothing as well. Without our modern understanding of microfibers and thermal layers, medieval people nevertheless developed sophisticated clothing systems to manage cold. Look at these illuminated manuscripts, an expert in medieval textiles suggested, showing me richly detailed images of winter scenes. See how the layers work? Linen undergarments to wick moisture, wool middle layers for insulation, and an outer layer of heavier wool or fur for wind protection. It's not that different from modern outdoor gear philosophy. What's particularly fascinating is how differently these survival systems operated depending on social class. The techniques available to nobles, four-poster beds, warming pans, private chambers with dedicated fires, created one experience of winter. The methods used by servants, communal sleeping, strategic positioning near heat sources, shared body warmth, created another entirely. Winter wasn't the same experience for everyone in the castle, a social historian emphasized. It wasn't even the same threat. For a well-fed noble with access to fuel and warm bedding, winter was primarily a discomfort. For an elderly servant with marginal nutrition and no private heat source, it was potentially lethal. This disparity in winter experience reinforced by the social hierarchy of medieval castle life. Access to warmth was a form of privilege as real and significant as access to food or wealth. Yet paradoxically, extreme winter crises sometimes temporarily flattened these hierarchies, forcing cooperation across social boundaries in the name of collective survival. There are fascinating accounts of winter emergencies where normal social rules were suspended, the social historian noted. Lords working alongside servants to gather fuel, nobles and commoners sharing sleeping spaces, food redistributed based on need rather than rank. These episodes were always framed as exceptional circumstances, but they reveal the flexibility that existed within seemingly rigid social systems. This flexibility, the ability to adapt both physically and socially to extreme conditions, was perhaps the most important survival tool in the medieval arsenal. When standard practices failed, when traditional hierarchies proved inadequate to the challenge, medieval castle communities could restructure themselves temporarily to prioritize collective survival. They were, in many ways, more adaptable than we are, suggested an expert in disaster management who studies historical responses to extreme conditions. Modern comfort has made us less tolerant of discomfort. We expect consistent temperatures, private sleeping spaces, unlimited hot water. Medieval people expected none of these things and could adjust more readily when conditions deteriorated. This adaptability extended to psychological strategies as well. The medieval approach to winter included not just physical preparations, but mental ones, rituals, prayers, and community practices designed to maintain morale through the darkest, coldest months. Winter was as much a psychological challenge as a physical one, a historian of medieval religion explained. The special prayers, the feast days that punctuated the season, the traditions of storytelling by firelight, these weren't just cultural practices. They were psychological survival tools, ways of creating meaning and maintaining hope during the most difficult time of year. Some of these psychological tools have survived into modern times, though often disconnected from their original survival context. Our traditions of gathering for holidays during the winter months, of telling stories around fires, of marking the winter solstice, all have roots in medieval practices developed partly as responses to the challenges of winter survival. Your Christmas tree, your holiday feasts, even traditions like hanging stockings, these all connect back to winter survival rituals, the religion historian noted. They were ways of creating light and warmth and abundance during the season of darkness and scarcity. The legacy of medieval winter survival extends far beyond these cultural practices, however. Many of our modern comforts and technologies have their roots in those early struggles against the cold. Take home heating, the evolution from open hearths to more efficient fireplaces with chimneys, then to stoves, furnaces, and eventually central heating began with medieval innovations designed to maximize warmth while minimizing fuel consumption. The transition from central hearths to wall fireplaces was revolutionary, an architectural historian explained. It allowed heat to be directed into the room rather than simply rising up and out. That basic principle that heat should be controlled and directed underpins all modern heating systems. Similarly, our modern beds, with their emphasis on insulation and heat retention, evolved from those medieval designs we've explored: the curtained four-posters, the raised platforms, the layered bedding systems. Memory foam and electric blankets might seem far removed from heated stones and bed curtains, a historian of domestic life pointed out, but they're addressing exactly the same needs, creating a microclimate for sleeping that's warmer than the ambient room temperature. Even our modern buildings, with their emphasis on insulation and energy efficiency, owe something to medieval lessons about heat management. The thick stone walls that made castles so cold also taught valuable lessons about thermal mass and heat retention that influence architectural design to this day. Medieval builders knew that thick walls cooled slowly and heated slowly, the architectural historian explained. That's why castle walls were often covered with tapestries, not just for decoration, but for insulation. The principle that you want to trap heat with layers of material is fundamental to modern building insulation. What's most remarkable about these medieval survival technologies is how they evolved without our modern scientific framework. Medieval castle dwellers didn't understand the physics of heat transfer or the biology of hypothermia in scientific terms. They developed their survival strategies through observation, experience, and the hard-won wisdom of generations who had faced the same challenges. They knew that body heat could warm an enclosed space like a bed with curtains, the domestic historian noted. They didn't need to understand convection currents or heat radiation to make use of that fact. Their knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, but no less sophisticated for that. This practical knowledge was passed down through generations, refined and adapted as needed. It formed a kind of folk science of winter survival that was no less valuable for lacking formal scientific terminology. Medieval people weren't ignorant, the historian emphasized. They were incredibly knowledgeable about their environment and how to survive in it. They just organized and transmitted that knowledge differently than we do today. As we reflect on the winter survival techniques of medieval castle dwellers, it's worth considering what we might learn from their experience, not because we need to sleep in four-poster beds or huddle together for warmth, but because their approach to environmental challenges offers insights still relevant today. They understood resource constraints in ways we're only beginning to relearn, suggested an environmental historian. They knew fuel was precious, that heat shouldn't be wasted, that body heat was a resource to be shared rather than isolated. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're principles we might need to rediscover as we face our own environmental challenges. Indeed, some contemporary environmental designers are drawing inspiration from medieval heating and cooling strategies. The principles of passive solar heating, thermal mass, and natural ventilation that inform sustainable architecture today have parallels in medieval design approaches. The greenest building practices today often look surprisingly medieval, the environmental historian noted, not because they're primitive, but because they're working with natural processes rather than overwhelming them with technology. Similarly, the social adaptations medieval communities made during winter emergencies, prioritizing collective welfare, sharing resources based on need, temporarily flattening hierarchies, offer models for crisis response that remain relevant. There's something to be learned from how these communities reorganized themselves during extreme conditions, the disaster management experts suggested. Not to romanticize the past, medieval crisis management was often harsh and inequitable by modern standards, but to recognize that social flexibility is as important as technical solutions when facing environmental challenges. As our journey through medieval winter nights comes to a close, we can appreciate these castle dwellers not just as historical figures, but as fellow humans who faced challenges we rarely encounter in our climate-controlled world. Their ingenuity, adaptability, and resilience in the face of conditions that would overwhelm most modern people deserve our respect and attention. The night watchman on the castle wall, turning his face to the spring sun after months of bitter cold, isn't just a figure from the past. He represents the human capacity to endure, to adapt, to survive conditions that seem insurmountable. His quiet statement, "Made it through another wintercast," carries the weight of that achievement, the recognition that survival wasn't guaranteed but earned through preparation, knowledge, and community effort. As you lie in your bed tonight, warm and comfortable in ways medieval castle dwellers could hardly imagine, consider the contrast between your sleep environment and theirs. Your temperature-controlled room, your engineered mattress, your precisely designed bedding with its optimized insulation. These comforts that we take for granted would have seemed miraculous to the people whose stories we've explored. The lord in his curtained bed, the servants huddled near the kitchen fire, the night watchman stamping his feet on the frozen ramparts. The distance between their experience and ours is measured not just in years, but in revolutions of comfort, in transformations of what humans expect from their environment. We no longer see warmth as something to be fought for, earned through effort and ingenuity. It's simply the baseline, the default state of our indoor environments. Yet something connects us to those medieval sleepers across the centuries, the relief of warmth after cold, the comfort of a safe sleeping place, the quiet gratitude for having survived another day. These experiences transcend time, linking us to our ancestors who slept in stone chambers with frost on the inner walls. Perhaps that connection is worth remembering as you drift towards sleep. The medieval castle dwellers who developed four-poster beds and warming pans, who huddled together for shared warmth, who endured conditions most of us will never face. They weren't just historical curiosities. They were people like us, seeking comfort and safety in a challenging world. Their struggles against the cold helped create the comfortable world we inhabit. Their innovations, refined over centuries, evolved into our modern comforts. Their practical knowledge, gained through bitter experience, laid foundations for scientific understandings we now take for granted. In a very real sense, we sleep warm tonight because they fought to sleep warm in their stone chambers. We benefit from the accumulated wisdom of countless winters, countless adaptations, countless small innovations that together transformed human sleep from a nightly battle with the cold into the comfortable experience most of us enjoy. So, as you settle deeper into your bed, appreciating its warmth and comfort, perhaps offer a quiet thought of recognition to those medieval sleepers, the lord and lady in their curtained bed, the servants on their pallets near the kitchen fire, the night watchman finally warming himself after hours on the frozen walls. They made it through their winters, and in doing so, they helped create a world where we rarely have to think about making it through ours. The night watchman, face still turned toward the strengthening spring sun, finally descends from the wall. His shift is over. The bitter winter has loosened its grip at last. Soon the castle will be fully alive with the day's activities, but for now, a peaceful quiet hangs over the stone walls. He makes his way to the kitchen, where the first fires are already being lit. The warmth embraces him as he enters, a simple pleasure made profound by months of bitter cold. Other servants nod in greeting, their faces showing the same quiet relief he feels. They've survived another winter. Not everyone did, but they're here, warming their hands by the fire, ready to begin another day. Their medieval world, with its hardships and hierarchies, its cold stone and precarious survival, seems distant from our comfortable modern existence. Yet across the centuries, something connects us to these people who fought the cold with every tool and technique they could devise. The human need for warmth and safety, the ingenuity that transforms hostile environments into habitable ones, the shared knowledge that passes from generation to generation, gradually transforming how we live and sleep. As you drift towards sleep in your warm, comfortable bed, that connection offers a final thought to carry into your dreams. The long human journey from those cold castle chambers to your bedroom tonight is a testament to our collective resilience, our capacity to transform our environment, our determination to create warmth even in the coldest circumstances. And perhaps that's worth remembering, worth appreciating as you sink deeper into the comfort that medieval castle dwellers helped create through their long struggle against the cold. Sleep well, you've earned it, just as they earned their rest after making it through another winter.